Good afternoon, everyone. Or good morning if you're tuning in from other parts of the world. We're all in the UK at the moment. The panelists for this talk, a lunchtime talk entitled Educating the Rainbow Children. And we've got a group of panelists from education institutions across the UK. And I guess to start out by a little bit of housekeeping, what we plan to do is give each of the speakers today 5 minutes to speak. And then what we'd invite you to do is to post questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Not the chat, but if you want to post a question, there's a separate area called Q&A. So if you can post your questions there, we'll be able then to work through them. So I just want to briefly introduce the speakers before we begin. We have Dr. Sue Patterson, who's Deputy Chair of the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy in the Young People and Families Division. We have Dr. Helen Bilton, who's a Professor of Outdoor Learning and Play at the University of Reading. We have Dr. Martin Bolton, who's the High Master at the Manchester Grammar School in Manchester, and Dr. Eleanor Overland, who's the head of the secondary PGCE at Manchester Metropolitan University. So before we begin, we'll have each of the speakers speaking, but if you'll indulge me, I wasn't sure until earlier this week what the Rainbow Children in the title referred to, and I discovered it was a poem written at the start of lockdown by a woman named Gemma Peacock, who's a mum from County Durham. And I thought we'd just start off by reading the last two stanzas of that poem to give us a little bit of a context and sort of to set off the discussion. So the last two verses go, and excuse my antipody and accent for someone who's obviously writing like they're in County Durham, because they are. The schools closed down, they miss their friends, they miss their teachers so. Their mums and dads help with their work, they helped their minds to grow. The parents used to worry that as schools were put on hold, their children wouldn't have the tools they'd need as they grew old. But history books will talk of them, now adults fully grown. These little boys and girls back then, the ones who stayed at home. They'll tell you that they fixed this world of all they would fulfill. The rainbow children building dreams they dreamed whilst time stood still. And so that last line, that idea of that we're in a bit of a holding pattern at the moment, that there is stasis, that you know, we are waiting for this to be over, and yet life goes on, education goes on, and there are all sorts of issues around how we transition to far more, I guess, what we've been calling most lately, emergency remote teaching, and how, if this is to be an ongoing proposition, how we can best serve the needs of our students at all different age groups. And we have representatives of people working with people in early childhood studies, primary and secondary education, as well as teacher training. So first of all, I'd like to invite Dr. Sue Patterson, who's the Deputy Chair of the BACP Young People and Families Division. She's a counsellor, psychotherapist, online trainer and researcher. Sue has had a long career working with children, young people and families in health visiting and child mental health, in addition to her long career at the universities of Durham and Newcastle, and presently with Arden University. So if you'd like to speak for 5 minutes, I'll let you know when your 5 minutes is coming to an end.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, well, first of all, it's wonderful to be here talking about children, young people, and I'm going to add the bit families, whatever a family means to a particular child or young person. And you're quite correct. My career started with children and young people when I was very young and started with my own family, taking child developmental modules with the Open University while caring for three boys under the age of 4 at one point, and now with a fourth child who is a primary school teacher and the font of all knowledge. I've really got to say she is the font of all knowledge. Primary school teachers are wonderful. And my role, I teach for Arden University social and developmental psychology, and I teach young people who often have found it difficult to access education for all sorts of reasons, often rooted in their early years. And I also do therapeutic play and counselling with young people, but the main bulk of my work as an independent practitioner in counselling and psychotherapy is with supervision, clinical supervision for counsellors, psychotherapists, mentors, working with young people, school counsellors in particular. And so I'm really looking forward to Martin's talk and information about how his school has coped with lockdown. I have one or two different contexts to explore and to give examples from. Excuse me. There is my practice. There is my role as Deputy Chair with Maggie Robson at the BACP for the Children and Young People's Division. And there is also my personal experience, which as a grandparent of 4 young grandchildren in different countries, is quite interesting to see how they've been affected. But I think first of all, the young people who are based in families who have caring people, parents, carers, grandparents, who can talk to them, explain things to them, read to them, work to them, and give them a rich environment, are going to do okay. Helen mentioned this yesterday when we had our briefing session, that children who are based in families who have a lot of stimulation are going to do okay. But children and young people who have difficult socioeconomic circumstances are going to suffer a lot more. And Martin touched on that in our brief yesterday also. Some children will be really badly affected. But I was locked down in France, and I'm actually still in France, and I travel to the UK tomorrow. So I've experienced a different lockdown to my daughter, who's been teaching throughout, even over the Easter holidays, children of the key workers. And she's explained that the children coming into school who come from different backgrounds and the children of the key workers, they've really worked hard. Teachers have worked very, very hard to make sure that children's emotional and mental health has not suffered, or has suffered as little as possible. So first, I think we need to acknowledge teachers as well as key workers in the medical sense, because they've kept children on track. But I would also like to acknowledge the counsellors, psychotherapists, school counsellors, play therapists, everyone who has worked throughout, online, on Zoom, with virtual sand tray work and play work and doing walk and talk and all sorts of different strategies to help children and young people who have suffered and who do have mental health needs. And these people are often not acknowledged because they're quiet, they're humble, they get on with the work that they're doing day to day. I'd like to finish, because I think I'm coming to the end of my 5 minutes. I'd like to finish by saying that the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy have a campaign. It's to address the government's spending review on mental health for children and young people. And this campaign has raised thousands of letters to MPs and ministers to get them to acknowledge and get them to fight for a counsellor in every school in England. Scotland have this money, Wales have it, Northern Ireland have it, but England does not. They have mental health practitioners and they do not have a counsellor in every school. So there's a campaign going. So if you see this campaign, please sign up to it. I'm going to end there because I know it is now.
Fantastic.
Helen.
So, no, that was perfect. So do you have a link to that campaign perhaps we could share in the chat?
I shall send it to you in the chat box.
Perfect.
Get it now.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Sue. That was just a really interesting perspective from I guess, a psychosocial perspective on children's development and the need for counselling support. And I think the very important point you raised at first, the importance of family, that so much of this starts at home, and the strains on the home environment are understandable. I need to do more research into exactly what a virtual sand tray is, but I think I might need to introduce that to a few friends with kids. Next up, I'd like to invite Dr. Helen Bilton to talk to us for 5 minutes. She's Professor of Outdoor Learning and Play at the University of Reading. She trained as an early years teacher, and for the past 36 years has been researching, teaching and disseminating about the outdoor teaching and learning environment for young children. She's also the lead educator on 2 FutureLearn courses, both very popular, supporting successful learning in primary school and supporting successful learning in secondary school. And I believe we're going to be able to post links to those courses in the chat as well. Helen, would you like to speak to us?
Thanks, Monty, and thanks, Sue. Yeah, I've just written a few thoughts. So, as Professor of Outdoor Learning and Play, I've been particularly interested in 3 things during this crisis. I mean, I'm generally interested in them, but the first is the outdoor environment, the second is physical development, the third is language development. So I'm just going to cover those in this brief talk. So with the initial lockdown, I was a little bit concerned that outdoors was being demonised. But however, as time went on, there was evidence from many quarters that were saying going outside was good. Thankfully, you know, mentally it was good for us, and physically it was good for us. And actually, if you went outside, you were less likely to catch an illness. So I was heartened by this sea change towards the outdoor environment and pleased that it wasn't demonised. So there've been more families walking and playing and being outside and being together. On the downside, I think there have been incidents which demonstrate people's lack of kind of knowledge about how to treat the nature with respect. I think a word of advice for the future is we shouldn't stop going outside now the weather is less warm. I was out this morning walking the dog, but I did have waterproof trousers, I did have wellies on, I did have a raincoat. Children and adults need to be outside whatever the weather, and they should be outside every day, and it's a healthy place. And you are less likely to catch illness if you are made strong by sort of being outside. And it doesn't matter whether it's warm or cold or raining or sunny, you just need to be outside. But as I've said, you need the right clothing. It's no good going outside and then getting cold because you will get unwell. And appropriate clothing is much harder if you're poor. In terms of physical development, I think now and for the future, we must understand what physical development means. I have to say it doesn't mean jerks, physical jerks, and behaving as though you're in a gym, as some people on social media have portrayed. That isn't what growing and actually young, delicate bodies need. Children need to be physically active all the time. And that's hence why, you know, if their play is so wonderful because it enables them to keep moving. If they're building a bridge or jumping a stream, they're using their whole bodies as well as alongside that learning something. We also need to be aware there's very strong evidence from David Gallagher that by the age of 7, if children don't reach the mature stage of physical development, it's very hard to claw back that those skills and abilities. In terms of language development, I think we must be aware of the research that's strong research, rigorous research, which is demonstrating that the number of words a child knows at 2 will predict how well they do in education at 11. Some children, I think, have benefited in lockdown because they've had more conversations with adults at home, which has helped their language and their vocabulary, but I would say many haven't. And language and spoken language is absolutely crucial to success, and it either enables you to be successful and part of groups, part of society, or not. And research from the Communication Trust evidences that if you can sort out language development problems by the age of 5.5, children are more likely to go on to develop good reading and speaking skills. So, yes, I think this crisis has impacted children's spoken language and physical development, and therefore, for the future, I think we need to be concentrating on very young children's development and education, particularly spoken language, physical capabilities and access to outdoors, and give them more opportunities than schools have given in the past, and even more opportunities now because of the crisis, I think. Added to that, I think we really need to concentrate on the early years workforce, which over the years has become less and less qualified, so that we now have many people in early years who simply don't have the knowledge about the stages of child development to really help children, and particularly children who are now behind with their, maybe behind with their, at their developmental level. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Helen. That was fantastic. And thinking about it in terms of children's development in outdoors, their physical development, and as a former language teacher myself, that idea that the number of words that a child knows at the age of 2 is a predictor of their language ability 9 years later, I think just how early this can have an impact if the kids aren't socializing, exchanging language with each other. Thank you so much. Next, we'll turn to Dr. Martin Bolton. Dr. Bolton is the High Master at the Manchester Grammar School, which was founded in 1515 with the express aim of educating the poor boys of Manchester in godliness and good learning, which I'm sure they continue to do to this day. Prior to taking up the post at MGS, he was the undermaster at Westminster School in London. He trained initially as an engineer, and prior to joining the teaching profession, he worked for De Beers and then Arthur Anderson. Martin, we'd love to hear your thoughts on education in COVID times.
I thought I'd just give a quick snapshot of how we dealt with the lockdown and what we're doing with the return to school. So we had a school VLE system, and about 2 weeks before the actual lockdown happened, we realised that if all our students and all the teachers went online, the whole system was going to crash. Our servers wouldn't have coped. So we had to make a very rapid decision, and that's when we decided we were going to move to Microsoft Teams. It was being used in the school by our computer science teachers, but otherwise nobody had really heard of Teams or seen Teams before. So we had a 2-week period, and we forecast, we hoped we would have 2 weeks to get it done in. It turned out we did. We trained all of the pupils, all of the staff. Everybody had a half-hour training session, and then we sent everybody off home and hoped that the whole thing would work. And I think it's interesting just how good software is nowadays, that you could, with a half-hour training session, then run a remote school with 2 weeks notice. And so everybody did go home, and we taught every single lesson. Now, I think one of the key things here, and I've stressed this, I did an article with The Guardian, the most important thing is that we are now in a world where every child should have access to the internet and a computer. And during lockdown, the one thing that governments should absolutely have put as a #1 priority is to ensure that every child could have an access to online learning. And without that, all of the technology isn't going to help. We dismantled all the desktop computers we had in school. We found every laptop we've got and we sent them home with the children. And often, you know, families where there are 2 adults both working from home and 3 or 4 children all working from home, there was a great need for more machines. And I think that's, if we take one thing away from this crisis, it should be that becomes a priority for us as a country, to ensure that children have access to the internet at home so that their education can be maintained under these kinds of circumstances. So we got everybody at home, and we got everybody online. The idea of being flexible about the way lessons were delivered became very important. So for a member of staff who's at home trying to teach a full timetable with 4 young children, what they can deliver compared to what someone else who doesn't have that same pressure had to be different. So we were very flexible. Some teachers taught complete lessons with video, others used the whiteboard function with just audio, and others just did it by setting some work at the start of the lesson with the chat function and then work being handed back. The one thing that we found universally was very good was the ability for pupils to hand work in and for feedback to be given. So all of our marking, in a sense, going online, and that function's something that we've maintained, and I think we're going to move to using Teams as our method of handing. My own teaching, I'm a physics teacher, I found that it actually, my marking changed completely. It became much more formative, and using the feedback function, I found with the same amount of time for the same marking, I was getting twice as much comment in terms of feedback on the work. And I was doing much less actually annotating the work and much more detailed description of what was right, what was wrong, what they needed to do. So I found my marking actually as an individual, and this was reported to me by lots of teachers, has come on leaps and bounds and improved, and the students are getting a better experience. The other bit is about the accountability of the pupils. I could literally log onto a piece of work as the pupil was writing it and could almost then send them a text message to say, I think you're going wrong here. But the excuses I left by homework at home has completely gone now, because you can see when they're doing it. It also gives me the flexibility. If a pupil does a piece of work early, I can mark it instantly, so I don't have to wait for handing day. So that little bit of it, of just the way that homework's used, was one of the big benefits we got out of it. It required an immense amount of commitment for staff, and I just cannot praise them highly enough for the amount of work and their willingness to try and make it work. You know, their desire to ensure that pupils didn't fall behind was just remarkable. But with the right technology, with a committed staff, with a pupil body who want to learn, we didn't feel that their academic studies, that very many will have fallen behind very much. The return to school's been another challenge. Social distancing. We've got one year group where 40 pupils have been home because of a positive case. We've had members of staff who have had to isolate because their children are isolating, so to look after children. So we've now got this mixed economy where we're using the same technology. And I watched recently a Chinese lesson being taught where the teacher was at home, the pupils were all in the classroom. We set up a video camera and they all had mini whiteboards, and a whole normal lesson went on with the teacher remotely from the class. We've now got classes where 4 or 5 pupils are at home, the rest are in the class, the teacher's in the class, and we just have a laptop on the desk with them zooming in on a Teams call, and they can interact in the lesson in just the way as if they'd been in the classroom. So we're finding that this technology allows us to continue as normal, so that if pupils are at home, if teachers are at home, we can still approximate a normal lesson for all of those pupils. And it wasn't about cost. Teams didn't cost us a penny, so we didn't spend money on this. But the key thing is having access to the internet and a computer allows schools to adapt and deliver education remotely. And so I think if that would be the message I'd send out. The final thing, and just to refer to what Helen was saying, on return, it's been really interesting. We decided very early on we were going to prioritise doing as much sport as possible, having the kids playing out at break times and lunch times. And we felt that aspect of school, if school had just become, you come to your lessons and you go home, that actually some of the mental health problems that can arise would be exacerbated. And so we had a big priority on getting the children outdoors as much as possible in their bubbles, but having them run around and play, because that's such an important part of their experience at school. And so we're getting on Saturday mornings to do those kind of things as well. That's a brief summary. I'm sure there'll be some questions, but hopefully that gives a snapshot of how we did things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin. That was a fascinating insight. I think your comment about the original VLE you had collapsing under the weight of the logins is certainly a pretty common occurrence, with obviously systems set up for much smaller numbers. And I think too, I'm aware of some programs around the world, like one laptop per child, sort of promotion of internet access as a human right, being an issue beyond the UK, and something that I think has become been brought into even more stark focus since the outbreak. Also, I thought it was really interesting that, you know, there are silver linings. The fact that teachers having a chance to do things like do more assessment feedback online, being able to improve their practice, speed up some quite manual tasks, I think is really heartening. And I thought it was also interesting, maybe something that we can return to after Eleanor's talk, this balance of the synchronous and the asynchronous interaction between teachers and students. I know I've just plugged in the chat a link to a course that we made, a rapid response course called How to Teach Online. And we talk a lot there about the ability to mix up some live sessions with things that the students can go and do in their own time, especially if they might not have regular access to a device. So perhaps we can circle back to that a little bit later. But next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Eleanor Overland. Eleanor is the head of the secondary PGCE at Manchester Metropolitan University. Manchester Metropolitan are one of the largest teacher training providers in the UK and are also home to the Education and Social Research Institute. Eleanor is passionate about education and preparing new teachers with the enthusiasm, knowledge, skills, and intellectual curiosity required to navigate their journey into the education profession. She's currently teaching the computing curriculum and its impact in schools. She's also the lead educator on 2 FutureLearn courses, Preparing for Teaching and Success as a Newly Qualified Teacher. Eleanor.
Thank you. So I'm just going to talk a little bit firstly about our response during kind of the immediate crisis in terms of our trainee teachers who were all out on placement and how we kind of supported them through. We're now thinking about the current student teachers and how we support them in terms of their development and preparing to start in the profession in this current situation. But then also I want to draw on some of the opportunities that it provides for new teachers and existing teachers in terms of their own research and perhaps exploring different ways of working in the classroom that they might not have done in the past, and how the situation, we were talking about silver linings, how this may have accelerated some of the natural evolution that was beginning to happen in education, and how we can perhaps capitalize on that. So initially I think we had about 600 secondary and then also several hundred primary students who were all out on placement, and every school response varied slightly in terms of the technology they were using, how they engaged with the pupils, how they set up their timetables. So we had all these different responses and we needed to support our student teachers to navigate those. And we also needed to support them as they completed the course, as it became clear that they weren't necessarily going to finish their placements in that face-to-face environment. So we had to move our own support online as well at the same time. So we had kind of huge sort of plethora of things that we had to address at the same time. One of the things that we did do was we put together a FutureLearn course called Success as a Newly Qualified Teacher, and we had that planned anyway, that we were going to do it, but we kind of accelerated that, and we suddenly had to get our alumni, our mentors, to make videos at home to support that course. So it looks very different to how we originally envisaged it, but actually it was so important in supporting that cohort from transitioning from their placement and that being cut short to actually now being NQTs themselves. And I think the schools have been brilliant in terms of the additional support that they're putting on for newly qualified teachers, because they understand that those student teachers might not have had the same classroom experience as newly qualified teachers in previous years. So the schools and the colleagues just generally are really helping our alumni in terms of bridging that gap. So in terms of this year, we've got a new cohort through. We've had to rethink how the course has been structured, and it's actually given us space to be able to prepare student teachers for starting in this world, as opposed to before it was all very reactionary. So we've actually made changes to the course. One of the things being is that we're actually preparing our student teachers for teaching online. And this is totally new. We've never done that with student teachers in the past. So myself having developed FutureLearn courses, and we've used the ABC model. We've also looked at the TPAC model. So we've started to pull in models that we might not necessarily have used before in terms of planning for teaching and learning, and also looked at different technologies and thought, how can we best support student teachers who are going into this world, and where actually they may find they land in schools where the teachers themselves are learning on the job, and it's trying to find what is the best practice that's out there and work with the schools in trying to put that package together. So that's been really interesting. We've also had to change how we're thinking about placements. So obviously schools need to be as COVID secure as possible. So we're encouraging a much more flexible approach to placements. And for anybody who is here who's from a school and they're a bit reticent about taking student teachers this year, what I would say is to think of it as an opportunity and perhaps a different way of working. So we've got some schools who are going to be working with the student teachers to provide intervention packages, so where students may have fallen behind. And I know we've touched on the different groups of students that may be, and some of those, in terms of social mobility, then it's really critical they have that additional support, and student teachers may be a way to provide some additionality for them. We've also thought about whether the student teachers can support that, where we've got that mixed method of teaching, where we've got some online, some face-to-face, that actually that extra person may be able to take responsibility for one or the other. We've also thought about where they are in terms of bubbles, because some schools have got quite specific bubbles. So you might end up with a student teacher who's a bit more specialist than they have been in the past, working with a particular bubble. So we're really open to lots of different ways of schools working with the student teachers, and it may look totally different to how it has done in the past. And I have to say, the cohort that we have got this year are amazing. They're so resilient and so open to new things. They're just like, yeah, we know it's a crazy world, and we'll just take the craziness and we'll suck it up and get on with it. And so they're being wonderful, which is really good. What we also want to do with our student teachers, with our alumni, we also have lots of alumni who come back on our master's programs and on the doctoral in education program, is we encourage a lot of research in terms of classroom-based research. And we think it's really important for classroom practitioners to be involved in research. And it's actually opened a huge sort of breadth of opportunity. I think there are obviously there are some massive implications that are quite negative in terms of the mental health of students, in terms of the gaps and where they've expanded, and I think it's really important that those are researched. But then there's also opportunities. So for example, Martin's already talked about assessment and different ways of interacting and different ways of providing sort of immediate assessment, rather than kind of just relying on these formative assessments. And it was massive, the pull of the GCSEs and the A levels. I don't think we've yet understood the enormity of that and how that's going to impact these students for years to come. So there's that side of things and around assessment, and is it going to change how we can perhaps frame that and use that? There's also been an interesting, this is anecdotal at the moment, around a reduction in stress. So we often think about the mental health and the stresses that has caused, but actually some students were less stressed during the lockdown, where they could perhaps work at their own pace, where there was perhaps more opportunities to work asynchronously, where there was perhaps more opportunities to discuss their learning informally. And I think there's lots of untapped areas there that we could perhaps explore and think, how can we bring that into mainstream teaching? And does it open opportunities that we might not have thought of before? Do we need to have every child in every lesson at every point, if that's perhaps not right for them? And can we perhaps think that, we might have variance in the ages that we have in a class if it's online? There's lots of different opportunities for that. So that's what I wanted to do, really, was to kind of think about how we've adapted. It's not been an easy journey. I don't want to kind of say, oh yeah, it's all been fine. It's not. There's been lots of different challenges, but I also think I talk to the students about landing in education in the most different and exciting time there has ever been in education, and the wealth of opportunities it gives to them as they start their journey in the profession.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Well, thank you very much to all four of the presenters. That was such an incredible range of perspectives and insights. Ellie, I think as someone who's also participated in creating a rapid response course, I feel yes, it's not pain. It's not pain. It was challenge. The challenges of doing that. You're in the process of making an online course for something like teacher training, and suddenly all the rules have changed. All the guidelines are out the window, and you're having to come up. You're having to, fly the train? Fly the train. You know what I mean? You have to fly the train. And also this idea too that we can now start to be a little bit more proactive about, we're not in a response mode anymore. COVID is occurring. We now need to sort of start to look right for this semester and the next. How are we going to prepare the next generation of teachers and the next generation of students for needing to work more online and from home? And I think too, that idea that if schools are considering cancelling school placements, that could have a really negative effect on the sort of next generation of young teachers coming through, to not have that the richness of the experience as a placement teacher. And definitely as an educational researcher as myself, although I've heard from my university that a lot of early PhD candidates have chosen to cancel their educational research because they're just not prepared for trying to take it online. I think it, as you say, it opens up all sorts of opportunities around just-in-time interventions, speaking further to Martin's ideas about increasing efficiencies for teachers. Thank you very much, everyone. Well, let's open with a few questions. I noticed in the Q&A box there was one, I think, which would, we've got here a question for Martin first, from a young man named Ryan Rushton. A question for Martin: how do you even go about planning for the short to medium term when things are so uncertain due to COVID?
It certainly feels like you're working from week to week. I've described the situation at the moment as everybody, the staff across the school, hanging on a cliff by their fingernails, and there's two people dragging a mattress towards you so you can fall off and land on it, and that's half term, and it still seems we're a long way from the bottom of the cliff at the moment. It is all still very reactive. I think every time you face a new challenge, so when we faced our first challenge of sending a part of a bubble of a group home, how do we then adapt to having half the children in, work a way through that problem? Then you try and normalise that, you try and share the experience with all the teachers. And I'm sort of hoping that at half term, we all get a big rest. We can look back at all the challenges we've had and maybe normalise some of those so they don't feel quite so daunting. But I think at the moment, everything is pretty daunting, and planning from week to week, you just have to wait and see what comes next. It all feels very reactive at the moment still. And I think that's going to continue. I'm hoping that this current phase will become more normal. I mean, at the first weeks of lockdown and teaching online were absolutely exhausting, and very experienced teachers referred to it as, it's like being in my first year of teaching again. You get home, you're exhausted, the planning is different, and everything's changed. By the end, I think a lot of people said, actually, no, I've worked out new ways of working, and it didn't feel quite so done. So I'm hoping this next phase feels like that. And I have no doubt there'll be some more challenges come along, and probably we'll be doing the same thing. I think that ability to just feel you can't plan for everything. You do have to look at when a challenge comes along, sit down, work out the best way, and then make a plan, and it might work, it might not, but being adaptive. So it does feel very reactive still.
Thanks. Would any of the the speakers like to just add to that? Eleanor, I guess in terms of the way you're more proactively training new teachers, what are some of the things you're sort of introducing?
So we've had to totally change our model. So we did have sort of initial university sessions, then our student teachers would go into school for a little bit, and then they would be back in the university, and there would be a lot more sort of coming and going. And to be COVID secure, we've stopped that. So we've gone to a block teaching model. So they're actually in university and then they're in placement. And that has brought advantages, but it's also brought challenges. So they've got quite an intense time where they've got university input and they're able to engage in academic studies, and we've been able to change assignment deadlines and things like that. But it actually makes it quite difficult when we're talking about some of the more pragmatic things that are going on in the classroom. If they've not yet been in the classroom themselves as a student teacher, that can be really quite difficult to visualize those. So what we've needed to do is to think very carefully about how we work with our school partners and try to communicate with them a lot more clearly in terms of the university and the way the university is working and the things that are going to be going on in school. So it's an opportunity to really strengthen our partnership, but it's also a challenge at the same time. So that block teaching model, that's happened across the university as well, so not just in teacher training, so that actually we're doing things as much as we can to be COVID secure, but it's actually had to get everybody to rethink about their pedagogy.
Fantastic. I'll move to the next question. I think this will probably be best answered by Sue. Sue, the question is, we praise teachers, but what about the impact on their mental health? They were also in lockdown, worrying about their own children and having to teach in a way that has never been done before on such a massive scale. Any research on how this is affecting them?
Okay, right, well, in a way, this links with the first question, because one of the most resilient factors in mental health is the ability to adapt to change. So it links with that. And teachers are very good at adapting to change, but quite correctly, they suffer as well. Being in lockdown, being at home, things changing daily, weekly, having your own children, perhaps having elderly parents to shield. There's a lot on teachers' shoulders. And I look back to my own young daughter, who's a 27-year-old primary school teacher and lives on her own. And to help her with her mental health, she decided her and another teacher at school, they would move in together. So there was two people together supporting each other rather than being isolated. And that carried on throughout lockdown. But when you look at the counselling and psychotherapy profession, there are the employment assistance programmes, sometimes provided by the government, sometimes by private organisations. And I'm sure that Martin's schools and the HR department will have an EAP that teachers can access counselling through. So some of the clinical supervision I've been doing over the past few months has been around supporting teachers and their mental health needs. Counselling sessions done on Zoom. If there's no privacy at home, you can sit in the car to access a private telephone session perhaps. But there are therapists up and down the country providing counselling sessions to teachers and other frontline staff. But research, is there any research being done in this area? Well, there isn't any that I personally know about, but there is definitely room for and a gap there where research into the mental health needs of teachers in relation to COVID-19 is totally important. And I think there's space there for a study. If we can come up with some funding, I'd be very happy to take part in such a study. So that's in relation to research. How can teachers be supported going forwards? Because this isn't going to stop now. This is going to go on and on. And then perhaps in the future, there'll be other situations where teachers have to adapt and change. But the way forward is, yes, teachers are great, but teachers are also quite resilient, but they have a breaking point. And I think perhaps research could be aimed at what that breaking point might be. Yeah, for teachers I've spoken to in a therapeutic context, the breaking point has been when a piece of technology didn't work that morning, when they were trying to provide an online lesson and they wanted to do the best they could for that particular class, for that particular group of children, and they couldn't. Another breaking point for teachers is when their own life at home becomes stressful due to personal circumstances that impact on their working lives. Divorce, relationship issues, sickness, children who just won't knuckle down and do the online, their children, not the teachers class or professional children, but their own children who won't just get on with their work while they're trying to also get on with the teaching work.
Yeah.
Can I say one more thing without taking
Yep.
just so in relation to something that Eleanor said about placements? The same issues are coming up with placements for counselling and play therapy trainees. They can't get face-to-face placements. So exploring placements that are not face-to-face and doing master's degrees and PhDs based on research that can be done electronically. These are all areas that can help.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Well, perhaps we can just change focus for a moment and go back to the role of parents. And I thought this might be a good time to bring in Helen to ask her the next question about the role of parents. So perhaps talking about things like the outdoor play, physical development, the development of language. What is the role of parents? We had to find a computer for each child, keep them happy, calm and happy, and homeschool while working. Should we focus on their schoolwork, which often causes conflict, or focus on keeping them happy?
This is interesting. There was a parents group at Reading where I spoke, and it ended up having hundreds of parents. And I think the first thing I said was, just try and survive, and just, lay off yourself. Don't try and be perfect. And just pat yourself on the back if you kind of all stay standing really by the end of the day, and then you can get to bed. The balance between happy and schoolwork, it goes kind of hand in hand really. I wrote a thing also for the kind of, you've got a 15-year-old and they don't want to do this, and etc, etc, etc. And I think we have to empathise with children, where they're coming from. If we're feeling under stress, goodness knows how they might be feeling. So from a parent's point of view, I think do the best you can would be my advice. As Martin said and Ellie said, I just take my hat off to teachers. I think they have been extraordinary in what they have achieved. Just incredible. So, trust your schools, your teachers, your head teachers. I think something that you could really, if you're thinking about language development and physical development, just get them out and get talking to them, and just literally talking about anything, because you can extend your language simply by having a learning experience. And mostly, a lot of the time, learning experiences happen outside, so going for a walk or, going to the park. But just, and if you're lucky and you've got the money and you can go further afield, that develops your language. But that would be what I would sort of want, and previously was advising parents. Do the best you can with the schoolwork. But if it becomes a battleground, you ain't going to achieve nothing. So you kind of have to an extent, put that to one side, empathise with the child, come back to it later, say, okay, how can I help? Can we break this down into small chunks? Because if, as I say, if we're overwhelmed, children can feel overwhelmed, and they need grown-ups to kind of just calm it all and not nag at them.
Absolutely. Martin, would you like to speak a little to your experience of the kind of advice you've been able to give to parents?
Yeah, I mean, we found that we got lots of thanks from parents that we provided routine. So the fact we followed our normal timetable, so the child would sit down at the computer and do that. I think that helps parents, and I think children are so used to routine in school that was one of the challenges of going to lockdown. If that routine was lost, it was a difficult world. So I would say that trying to keep some of that routine with the work is a help. But again, as we've seen when they returned, the chance for them just to go outside and run around, that's really important as well. It's a really difficult balance. I think you have to know your own child, and just get that balance right between try and maintain some routine that helps with the work, but also have those really important breaks where, at school, every few periods they'll go outside and they'll run around and with their friends. That matters too. And I think part of the problem with lockdown was everybody was stuck inside, and that makes things more difficult.
Absolutely. Martin, there's a question here that touches on something Eleanor mentioned. Eleanor mentioned that experienced teachers are supporting new qualified teachers coming through with classroom experience. Is it working both ways? Are newly qualified teachers bringing their knowledge of online strategies to support existing teachers, especially with their first-hand experience as online learners? Do you have any new teachers who might have been able to bring insights and learnings?
Yes, yeah, no, that's very much the case. And it was certainly, we had some PGC placements at the time, some from MMU actually, and from Manchester University. And they were great. They were helping write questions, deliver stuff. So we incorporated them into the process. We're thinking about how we face the challenges of giving meaningful program for the trainees we've got lined up for this year. But yes, without a doubt, the young tech savvies were brilliant with helping develop it. One thing I would say is that we think we've come on where we are now is probably where we would have been in 5 years in terms of the development of tech in the school. Getting that sort of change to move a lot of stuff onto online using Teams, that would have taken a long time to train staff and to get the buy-in from staff, and particularly for staff who've been teaching without tech for a very long time. And we found that this whole process, if one good thing's come from it, we've just made a huge leap forward in that aspect in terms of developing all of our teachers, and the young staff who were using this technology were instrumental in that.
That's a nice way to segue to a quickfire round. There's a question here. Martin O'Hanlon asks, and I thought we could see if we get a response from each of the speakers. Martin says, during this time, we have all had to innovate to find solutions to problems. Is there anything you found surprising and you will definitely continue doing going forward? Who would like to start? Anything you found surprising, processes, tools, ways of working that you'll definitely keep using into the future?
I just like the fact that you can just go on Teams and ask a question, and you don't have to doodle poll and spend hours trying to find a place to have a meeting, and you can just get the answer sorted, done and dusted. So it's a bit like all we had was a phone, so you rang somebody. So I've liked that.
So what do you find, what have you found as being sort of a change in your behaviours?
Well, what I've found is that I provide online courses and have my own learning platform and my own online learning school for counsellors and psychotherapists. And what I've found is that if, for example, a school counsellor, like I was asked something the other day, are there any courses around on walk and talk counselling in schools? Not many, or they might be too expensive. So I'll design a program, which I'm in the middle of doing now, and then I'll put it up online. What I've found is that being able to provide online courses and CPD, which is responsive, not necessarily reactive, but responsive to the needs of the particular practitioners who are working with children and young people. That's what I'm doing, and I'm going to keep on doing that. I haven't found any other way to do it through any particular organisation, so I do it through my own.
And that sort of just-in-time provision, I think, is becoming really important. Eleanor, how about you?
So I think I was going to say the kind of the just in time, but also the asynchronous teaching. I think the amount, particularly at university level, the students have appreciated that flexibility, and that actually, you know, we have some students who work much better in the morning, some in the evenings. So that has been really embraced by them. And I think we were always very conscious about timetables before, particularly in university, and when everybody's available and when we've got timetable clashes and all those sort of things. So there's that potential there. But also as a result of that, the informal communications with learners, both between themselves, but also with tutors and with teachers. My husband's also a teacher as well. So actually, you know, children and students have been able to email and say, actually, I'm a bit stuck on this. And initially, it was a lot of tech questions about I can't access this or I can't access that. And actually, that communication seems to have evolved. And so students have become quite good at advocating for themselves when they can't do things and when they're stuck, and seeking support, but also from each other as well. And, you know, there are students who are having conversations with each other on FaceTime about the session that they're working on. And so it's kind of opened up a whole way of communication in learning, which I think is a real positive.
Indeed. I'm just looking at the final questions and conscious of the time. There's one here for Martin. I think it's an interesting one too. Any plans for children to engage with pupils in other schools in the community online so we don't lose inter-school dialogue at student level? That was from Paul Stapley into Film.
Yeah. So one of the things we feel we have lost is our students do go out to hundreds of schools across Manchester. It's been a very important thing for us. And it's one of the areas we at the moment haven't replicated online. We are, however, using FutureLearn. So we've seen there's a real opportunity. We're going to be developing courses for FutureLearn. So we are going to be putting some courses online. The first one's going to be on the Moss Side riots, which is being developed at the moment. So we feel that sharing a lot of the good things that we do. Now, we're also using this as an internal thing to deliver some of our enrichment courses. And again, the fact we can do those asynchronously is great. And so I think we as an institution see that we're going to be able to put a lot of really good free content out there using this sort of platform, which should benefit. We're keen to get back into the experience of our students going to other schools benefits our students immensely, and so we're really keen to start replicating that. We haven't yet managed to achieve that with Teams, but that might be one of the things we start to look at after half term when we've got a bit of headroom.
Yeah, it's something that I hadn't considered, the idea of inter-school dialoguing. So we're just about out of time. I'm not quite sure if this is the kind of Zoom call that will just automatically cut. So if it does, just very quickly, thank you to everyone. I wanted to just address one question here from Matt Hogan. It's a really interesting one, really pertinent, I think, to some of the things in particular that Martin was saying. How do you engage learners who do not have access to the internet or the digital skills to access resources? Matt, I wanted to just speak to this one briefly myself, because my PhD research looked at this area in particular, looking at online education in the Global South. And the course that I linked to in the chat also has a section on access and what we can do in times like COVID to continue providing education resources. And it might be about things like looking at mobile phones, looking at sending class instructions to students via text message, but certainly looking at the what we can do that perhaps doesn't need to be online, and that's where I think the importance of the mix of asynchronous as well as synchronous learning needs to take place. I think that many people have this idea that a good lesson is a live Zoom chat, a little bit like this one, where we're all interacting, but that requires, as you probably many of people have experienced, a really good internet connection. Would anyone else like to speak to that, to the idea of engaging learners who don't have access to the internet?
I know my daughter, as a primary school teacher, spoke to me about this. Living in a small town, teachers were going out in their cars and some on their bicycles if they were feeling very sort of fit, and giving out learning resources, delivering learning resources to children who but lived within, you know, well, most of them did live within a certain distance of the school anyway, a local school, and providing that type of learning resource rather than online. The same teachers were also giving out the free school meals using the same mechanism. So, so that was one way, actually delivering hard copies of materials and books and exercises, and then picking up their responses and their work.
Some innovative, slightly offline approaches to teaching during COVID. That's fantastic. Look, that might be a good time to end proceedings today. Thank you so much to all the presenters and everyone for attending and their fantastic questions. I'm sorry that we missed a couple. I'd like to just thank again Dr. Sue Patterson, Dr. Helen Bilton, Dr. Martin Bolton, and Dr. Eleanor Overland, who I'm sure you'll agree just gave us so much information. There's so much insight, and thank you all so much for your time.